Hi everyone. My name is Maya Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and I live alone in a two-bedroom apartment in Denver, Colorado, a city where exactly 0 people from my childhood know my address. I want to say that last part again because it matters. 0 people. Not my high school friends, not my neighbors growing up, not my aunt or my uncle or the cousins I used to see every Thanksgiving. And most importantly, not my parents. I chose that. I chose every part of it. And for 11 years, it worked perfectly. My life was quiet. It was mine. I had my job, my little herb garden on the balcony, my Thursday wine nights with my friend Priya, and a therapist named Dr. Harlow, who I'd been seeing every other week since I was 22. I had built something that felt like peace, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. And then, 14 months ago, on a Thursday evening in October, someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Priya had canceled. I thought maybe it was a package. So I looked through the peephole, and I had to grab the door frame to keep from stumbling backward. It was my mother. She was standing in the hallway of my building in Denver, Colorado, a place I had never, not once, told her I lived, holding a paper grocery bag against her chest like a shield. She looked older. She looked smaller. And she was crying before I even opened the door. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that she knocked again, softer that second time, almost like she already knew she didn't deserve an answer. I still don't know exactly why I opened that door. Maybe I'm still figuring that out. But what happened over the next 3 weeks, what she told me, what I finally found out, and what I ultimately decided to do, is the story I've been wanting to tell for a long time. And I think a lot of you are going to understand it in ways that hurt a little bit. So, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a small city in central Ohio called Maplewood. It's one of those places that looks like a greeting card in October and smells like cut grass in June, and mostly just feels like standing still while the rest of the world moves. My parents, Richard and Carol Calloway, had 2 daughters, me, Maya, the oldest by 4 years, and my sister, Sienna. On paper, we were a normal family. Dad worked in insurance. Mom was a dental hygienist for most of my childhood. Then she quit to help manage Sienna's schedule, once Sienna started competitive figure skating at age 8. We had a ranch-style house with a detached garage and a dog named Biscuit who chewed through 3 pairs of my sneakers before we finally got a baby gate. Normal, right? Except, here's the thing about being invisible inside a family, it's not like anyone announces it. No one sits you down and says, hey, just so you know, your sister is the important one, and you're basically furniture. It doesn't work like that. It works through accumulation. It's 1,000 tiny things that each feel like they could maybe just be coincidence, until you're 17 years old, looking at a collage wall in your parents' living room and realizing there are 43 photos of Sienna and 11 of you, and 9 of those 11 are from group photos where you happen to be standing nearby. I counted. I was 17 and I counted. That's the kind of kid I was. Quiet, observant, always paying attention to things that other people assumed nobody noticed. My parents weren't cruel people. I want to be clear about that because this story gets complicated if you think of them as monsters. And they weren't. They were flawed. They were limited. They had one child who sparkled and one child who didn't. And they just kept walking toward the light. Sienna sparkled. She genuinely did. She had this quality that people noticed the moment she walked into a room. Bright eyes, easy laugh, the kind of kid who adults crouched down to talk to because she made them feel seen. She started skating young, and it turned out she had real talent. By the time she was 10, she was placing in regional competitions. By 11, she was training 6 days a week with a private coach named Victor, who drove a silver Audi and had opinions about everything from Sienna's blade, sharpness, to what she ate for breakfast. And my parents were completely, utterly consumed by it. I don't mean that as blame fully. I've done enough therapy to understand that sometimes people get tunnel vision, and they don't even realize what's happening to the people standing just outside the frame. But I also want to be honest. The tunnel vision had consequences. For me, real ones. Like the year I was 13 and I'd been selected to attend a summer writing program at Ohio State. A real program, competitive. You submitted a portfolio and they picked 20 kids from the whole state. I got in. I was so proud I cried in my room by myself because I didn't know how else to process it. I went downstairs and told my mom at dinner. She said, "That's wonderful, honey," and then turned to ask Sienna, whether her ankle wrap was tight enough before her practice the next morning. That was it. That's all I got. And I know, that doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. Parents get distracted, life gets busy. But the writing program cost $400 that I didn't have. And when I finally worked up the nerve 3 days later to ask my dad about it, he told me they didn't have it in the budget right now with Victor's fees going up. Victor's fees. I didn't go to the program. A few months later, Sienna got new skates. Custom. They cost $600. I started keeping a mental ledger around that time. Not out of greed, I want to be really clear about this, but out of self-preservation. When you're a kid who isn't sure she matters, you start collecting evidence. You start trying to figure out if the gap between how you're treated and how your sibling is treated is as wide as it feels, or if you're just being dramatic. I wasn't being dramatic. The ledger grew every year. The family vacation to Florida when I was 15, where I couldn't go because someone had to watch the dog, and my parents took Sienna to Disney World. The car my parents bought for Sienna when she turned 16, a used Honda, nothing fancy, but it was a car. While I was told when I turned 16 that I should look into getting a job if I wanted driving money. The birthday parties. Sienna's Sweet 16 was a catered event in our backyard with a DJ and string lights and 40 of her friends. My 16th was a grocery store cake and dinner at Applebee's with my parents, who spent most of it on their phones following Sienna's competition scores remotely, because she was at a regional meet that weekend. I'm not saying I wanted a DJ. I'm saying I wanted to feel like someone noticed it was my birthday. If you've ever been in a family where you were not the favorite, if you've ever sat across the table at Christmas and watched your sibling unwrap the thing you quietly told your mom you wanted, and then you got socks, then you already know exactly what I'm describing. You already know this particular kind of ache. It's not dramatic and it's not explosive, it's slow. It's like being in a room where the heat keeps getting turned down 1 degree at a time, and nobody else seems to notice, because they're not the ones standing near the vent. I want to ask you something actually. If you're watching this and you grew up as the other kid, the one who wasn't the golden child, drop a comment below. I want to know I'm not alone in this. Because for a long time, I genuinely thought I was. Everything I just described, that was the prologue. The actual story, the moment that changed everything, happened when I was 17 2 months into my senior year of high school. I'd been accepted to the architecture program at the University of Michigan. Early decision. I hadn't even told anyone, except my guidance counselor and Priya, who was my best friend then too. I'd applied in secret almost, because I'd learned by then that announcing good news in my family tended to result in one of two outcomes. Either it was briefly acknowledged and then forgotten, or it somehow became about Sienna. But Michigan was different. Michigan was the dream, and it was going to cost money, a lot of money. I knew my parents had opened college savings accounts for both of us when we were born. My dad had mentioned it over the years. It was one of those things he said with a kind of quiet pride, like it was proof he was a responsible father. Don't worry, we started the accounts when you were babies. You're both taken care of. I believed him. I'd been believing him for 17 years. So one Sunday afternoon in October, I remember exactly because it was the week before Sienna's first big competition of the season, and the house was tense with the energy of that. I asked my parents to sit down with me. I told them about Michigan. I told them about the program and the acceptance and what it would mean for my future. My mom teared up, which surprised me. My dad nodded slowly, the way he does when he's processing something. And then he said, "Maya, we need to talk to you about something." I still feel the shift that happened in my chest in that moment, like something small and fragile cracking under pressure. My dad explained it in the way that people explain things when they've rehearsed the explanation and are hoping the rehearsal makes it go down easier. Sienna's training costs had escalated significantly over the past 3 years. Victor had a new fee structure, competition travel, new equipment, a nutritionist. The thing is, and here's the part that I have replayed in my head approximately 10,000 times. They had needed to make a decision 2 years ago, when the costs first started spiraling. And the decision they made quietly without telling me was to redirect my college fund to Sienna's skating. My college fund, the account that had my name on it. The money that my grandparents had contributed to over the years, that birthday checks and Christmas cards had fed into for 17 years. That was gone. It had been going to Victor and competition fees and custom skates and travel hotels for 2 years already. My dad kept talking. I don't remember exactly what he said after a certain point. I know he said something about how they planned to help me figure out loans, and community college might be a good starting point. And Sienna had a real shot at something extraordinary. I know my mom's was crying. I know she kept saying, "We're so sorry, sweetheart," in a voice that somehow made it worse. I didn't cry. I don't know why. I think I'd been emotionally practicing for something like this for years without knowing it. I think part of me had always, at the deepest level, understood that this was what I was to them, that I was the one who got the leftovers. I excused myself from the table, and I went to my room, and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I stayed very, very still. And I thought, I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back. I was 17 years old, and I had already made up my mind. I graduated high school in June, and I did not go to community college. I did not take out loans for a school my parents approved of. I did not sit in the house in Maplewood and watch my college fund evaporate further into Victor's monthly invoices. I got a job at a coffee shop and I worked doubles for 4 months until I had saved $3,000. And then I applied to a drafting and design certificate program at a technical college in Columbus. That cost just under $2,000 for the year. I paid for it myself. I found a room in a shared house with 3 other people and I paid my portion of rent by picking up weekend catering shifts. I called home twice. Once in September, once around Christmas. My mom mostly talked about Sienna's competition season. My dad asked if I was eating enough. Neither of them asked how I was affording rent or whether I had health insurance or whether I was scared. I was all 3 of those things, but they didn't ask, so I didn't say. I stopped calling after that, not as a dramatic statement, not as revenge, simply because I realized that continuing to call home felt like continually returning to a well that had run dry. I was using up emotional energy I didn't have for a connection that was mostly one-sided anyway. The certificate program turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. I found out I was genuinely good at this, at drafting, at spatial thinking, at translating a vision into something structural and real. My instructor, a quiet, serious man named Professor Adkins, told me in my second month that I had an instinctive feel for design that he didn't see often. That was the first time in years that an adult had looked at something I produced and said it was genuinely impressive. I cried in the parking lot after that class, full ugly crying, for a long time. After the certificate, I got a job at a small architecture firm in Columbus. Junior drafter, entry level, but it was real. I was 21. I kept my head down, and I worked hard, and I spent my evenings in the library reading everything I could about architectural design, sustainable building practices, structural engineering. 3 years later, I had saved enough to pursue a part-time degree program while working full-time. 6 years after that, I was a licensed architect, 31 years old, fully licensed, with a portfolio I was proud of and a job offer from a firm in Denver that I accepted with almost zero hesitation, partly because Denver was beautiful and partly because it put a lot of miles between me and Ohio. And somewhere in all of that, the working and the studying and the slowly, painstakingly building, I had made a decision that became so automatic I barely even thought about it anymore. I simply did not tell my family where I was. They had my old Columbus number for a while. Then I got a new phone and a new number, and I didn't pass it along. I had no social media. My LinkedIn was a professional profile with no location listed and a name-only contact form. I wasn't hiding exactly. I just wasn't reachable. That wasn't peace, Dr. Harlow pointed out once. She said it more gently than that. She said it was a protective structure that made sense given what I'd experienced, but that eventually I would want to examine whether I was protecting myself or just postponing a confrontation. I was not interested in examining that at 26. At 28, I was maybe a little interested. At 33, I was thinking about it seriously. And then my mother appeared in the hallway of my apartment building in Denver, holding a grocery bag and a broken expression, and I didn't get to think about it on my own terms anymore. Let me tell you what it's like to open your front door to a parent who chose your sister over you. You know how sometimes in movies there's a scene where the character opens a door, and on the other side of it is something they've been afraid of their whole life, and the camera just holds on their face. That silence before anything is said, that's what it felt like, except I wasn't afraid. I was something else entirely. I was still. like my whole nervous system went into a kind of suspended animation, trying to figure out what response was appropriate for a situation I had never actually planned for. My mother said Maya, just my name, like I might have forgotten it. I said, "How did you find me?" She said Priya had told her. "We'll come back to that." I let her in. I still don't know if that was the right decision, but I let her in. She came into my apartment, and she looked around at the bookshelves, and the drafting table in the corner, and the photographs on the wall, all places I'd been, views from buildings I'd designed, and she started crying harder. "You've done so well," she said. "You've done so well, Maya." And I thought, do you know what I did not say? I did not say no thanks to you. I know some of you are typing that right now, and I love you for it, but I didn't say it. I poured her a glass of water and I sat across from her at my small kitchen table and I said, "Tell me why you're here." She took a breath. She collected herself with the practiced difficulty of someone who has had to deliver bad news before and hasn't gotten better at it. She told me that my father was sick, that he'd had a heart attack in August and a second smaller one in September, that he was managing with medication, but that he had been unable to work since August, and that between his medical bills and the fact that my mother had been taking time off to care for him, their finances were in serious trouble. "How serious?" I asked. "We may lose the house," she said. I held that for a moment. Then I said the obvious thing. "What about Sienna?" My mother's face did something complicated. It rearranged itself into an expression I hadn't seen before, something between grief and shame and something else I couldn't name. "Sienna isn't available," she said. I sat very still. What does that mean? And then my mother, in my small Denver kitchen, started telling me a story that I had not known was happening. A story that had apparently been building for years while I was in Colorado minding my own business. I want to share that story with you, but I need you to stay with me for a minute here, because there's a lot coming, and the things I learned that night genuinely took my breath away. Okay? Don't go anywhere. Here's what my mother told me about Sienna. Sienna had peaked at 17. In the skating world, she had been genuinely talented. My mother wasn't delusional about that, but she had not been elite. She had placed well at regionals. She had not qualified for nationals. At 19, she'd developed a stress fracture in her left ankle that required surgery and a long recovery, and when she came back to training, she could tell, Victor could tell, that something had shifted. The fire, or maybe just the body's capacity, had changed. My parents had by that point spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000 on Sienna's skating career over a decade. $80,000 between the training fees and the travel and the equipment and a brief move to a different city when Sienna was 16 to be closer to a competitive rink. $80,000 that had included, yes, my college fund, which had been somewhere around $18,000 at the time they started pulling from it. Sienna had retired from competitive skating at 20. My parents had been devastated in that way that parents who have overinvested in a child's dream are devastated, almost as if the loss belonged to them more than to her. Here's the part that gets complicated. After skating, Sienna had not flourished. She had not, as my parents had always vaguely implied, pivoted gracefully into some other remarkable life. She had instead gone through a series of jobs she quit, a relationship with a man my parents had not liked that lasted 3 years and ended badly, a period in her mid-20s that my mother described carefully as a difficult time, which I gathered from context meant something clinical, depression or worse. My parents had supported her financially through all of it, through the difficult time, through the relationship ending, through the 3 jobs she'd left and the gap months between them. They had not made her pay rent when she moved back home at 24. They had continued to pay her car insurance and her phone bill until she was 27. And here was the part that landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. 18 months ago, Sienna had met someone online, a man who lived in Portugal. Within 6 months, she had liquidated a small investment account my parents had set up in her name, their remaining savings, about $30,000, taken the money and moved to Portugal. She sent occasional text messages. She did not send money. She had not responded to my father's heart attack with anything except a voice memo saying she was sorry and that flights were expensive right now. My mother sat at my kitchen table and told me all of this. And when she was done, there was a long silence. I realized I had been holding my breath. "So," I said slowly, The child you poured everything into, the child you redirected my college fund to, is in Portugal. And the child you never invested in is sitting across from you in a nice apartment she paid for herself. My mother flinched. Maya, I'm not angry, I said. I'm just saying it out loud because I think one of us needs to. She started crying again. We made mistakes. We know that. We've known that for a long time. With you. You didn't see me, I said. We saw you. She said, we always saw you. She stopped. We didn't show you that we did. And I don't know how to explain why, except that Sienna needed so much, and you always seemed like you were handling things. I had been handling things because no one else was going to. I knew it wasn't the right moment to say that, so I didn't. Instead, I asked where she was staying, and she said a hotel nearby, and I said okay, and I told her I needed some time to think and I would be in touch. She left. I stood at the window and watched her get into her rental car, and I felt nothing at first. Just the strange hollow quiet of a very large thing having just landed. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and called Priya. You gave her my address, I said. Not accusatory, just fact. Priya was quiet for a second. Yes, I'm sorry. I should have asked you first. She called me, and she was really scared. Your dad is not doing well. I know. I just thought you should know. I thought you'd want to make that choice for yourself instead of having it made for you by absence. That was Priya. That's always been Priya. Doing the thing I might not have done for myself, but that some part of me needed. I'm not angry at you, I said. Are you angry at her? I thought about it. No. I don't think I am. I think I'm tired. I've been managing the feeling of this for 11 years, and now it's just here, in my kitchen, crying. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Do you want to help them? That specific question sat in my chest for the next 4 days. Because the honest answer was complicated in a way that I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. Here's the truth about the child who is not the favorite. You spend years, sometimes decades, preparing to feel nothing for the people who overlooked you. You build this whole architecture of emotional distance. You move cities, you change numbers, you make your life so full that there's no room for them in it. And you tell yourself it doesn't hurt anymore. You tell yourself you've healed and moved on, and that you don't need their validation. And then your mother shows up with a paper bag and a broken expression, and you realize that the opposite of love isn't indifference. I was not indifferent. I was furious. I was grief-stricken. I was still, underneath all the success and the therapy, and the Denver apartment and the licensed architect title, still the 17-year-old girl who found out she wasn't worth $18,000 to her own parents. Those feelings don't just dissolve because you do well for yourself. I talked to Dr. Harlow. She asked me what I wanted. Not what I thought I should do, not what would look generous or impressive or appropriate. What did I, Maya Calloway, actually want? I sat with that for a long time. My mother was in Denver for 2 weeks. I had coffee with her 3 times. Each time was careful and quiet and full of the silences that happen between people who have a lot of history and haven't yet figured out which parts of it to say out loud. On the 4th day, I agreed to fly back to Ohio with her for a few days to see my father. The house in Maplewood looked the same from the outside and completely different on the inside. Smaller, dimmer. The living room furniture was the same but worn, and there were medical pamphlets on the coffee table and a blood pressure monitor on the kitchen counter. The collage wall was still there. I glanced at it when I walked in and did not stop to count. My father was in the recliner in the living room. He had lost weight. His face looked like someone had taken it and folded it a few more times than it was designed for. When I walked in, he didn't try to stand. He just looked at me, and then he put his hand over his eyes for a moment the way men of his generation do when they're trying not to cry. Hey, Dad, I said. Hey, Bug, he said. Bug. My childhood nickname that I hadn't heard in 11 years. Something broke open very slightly in my chest. I sat next to him. We didn't do a big dramatic scene. My dad has never been that kind of person, and I haven't either. We just sat. I asked him how he was feeling. He told me honestly, which he never used to do. He said some days were better than others, and that the second heart attack had scared him badly. After a while, he said, I know I owe you an apology that's overdue by a lot of years. Yeah, I said. You do. I'm not going to make a speech, he said, because I don't think I deserve the relief of a speech. I just want you to know that we got it wrong, that you deserved better. He stopped and looked at the window for a moment. You turned out remarkable, Maya, and we didn't help you do that. You did it. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say it to your face. I nodded. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't okay, and he'd said he wasn't making a speech for a reason. He wasn't asking me to say it was okay. I stayed 4 days, I cooked dinner twice. I looked at their finances, and I made some calls, and I did what I do well, which is look at a problem structurally and figure out what can be done. When I left, I drove to the airport and I sat in the departures lounge for 45 minutes before my flight, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried in a very long time. Not out of sadness exactly, out of the effort of it, of being human with people who had hurt you, of deciding to show up for the complexity instead of running from it. It was exhausting and somehow necessary. I want to be honest with you about what I chose to do, because I think there's a version of this story that ends with a big triumphant speech and a door slammed in someone's face and revenge, served cold, and I understand why that's satisfying to watch. But that's not what actually happened. And I think the real ending is more interesting anyway. I did not give my parents money. Not directly. That's an important distinction. Here is what I did. I hired a financial advisor I trusted to sit down with my parents and go through their situation completely. Their house had significant equity. They had owned it for 30 years, and they had paid down most of the mortgage. The solution, it turned out, was not cash infusion. It was a reverse mortgage that would stabilize their income and allow them to stay in the house. My parents hadn't known that was an option. The financial advisor walked them through it, and it worked. I paid for that consultation, $200. I did not consider that a gift. I considered it basic human decency. I also made one phone call that I want to tell you about. I called Sienna. I had not spoken to my sister in 11 years. She answered on the third ring with a confused hello, because she didn't have my number. It's Maya, I said. A pause. Then, oh my God. Maya. Hi, I said. I'm going to say this directly, because I don't have a lot of time or patience for anything else. Dad had 2 heart attacks. Mom is alone trying to manage it. You have money that actually belongs to them that you moved to Portugal with. I'm not telling you what to do with it, but I think you already know what the right thing to do is. Silence. How did you? Mom told me, I said. Look, I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling because you are their daughter, and I'm not going to carry this for both of us. More silence. And then she said quietly, He's stable, I said. Call them, Sienna. I hung up. 2 weeks later, my mother called to tell me that Sienna had sent $15,000 and had begun calling every Sunday. I don't know what Sienna's life is like now. I don't know if she's found her footing or is still looking. I have complicated feelings about her that are not clean or resolved. She was also shaped by our parents' choices in ways that weren't her fault. She was handed too much too soon and then left to figure out that it wasn't enough. I'm not absolved of being angry at her, but I'm also not interested in making her the villain. The villain, honestly, was nobody, or everybody a little. That's the unsatisfying truth of a real story. It's been 14 months since my mother knocked on my door. She calls me every Sunday too now. We talk for about 20 minutes. I've driven to Maplewood twice, once for my father's cardiology appointment, once for no reason except that I wanted to see how the maple tree in the front yard was doing. It's fine. It's enormous now. I'm not going to tell you we're healed. I don't think there's a word yet for what we are. We are in process. We are figuring out how to be in each other's lives after a very long time of not being. It doesn't feel like the movies. There's no single moment where everything becomes okay. There are just smaller moments, my dad asking about a building project I'm working on, and actually listening to the answer. My mom sending me a card for my birthday in March that arrived 2 days early and had 3 paragraphs in it instead of a sentence. Small things that are also large things, if you understand what I mean. The Priya thing, by the way, I have forgiven her entirely, because giving my mother my address was a gift even if it didn't feel like one at the time. Priya knows me well enough to know that I would have needed a push, and she loves me well enough to give it. Dr. Harlow, for her part, has been insufferably pleased with how all of this has gone. Not in a smug way. In the way that a person who has watched you work toward something difficult is pleased when you finally do the hard thing. She says I've moved from avoidance to engagement, which apparently is significant in therapeutic terms. I told her that sounds like something you'd put on a motivational poster and she laughed. And my father, my dad, who called me bug and lost weight. and put his hand over his eyes so he wouldn't cry. Asked me at Christmas last year whether I'd ever thought about coming home for good. Moving back to Ohio, I said no, not because I was punishing him, but because Denver is mine. I built it myself. The apartment, the job, the herb garden on the balcony, the life that fits me. I made all of that from scratch without anyone's help or investment or belief. And I think you can love the people who failed you without giving up the life you built in their absence. I think those things can coexist. It's uncomfortable and it doesn't make for a neat ending, but it's real. He nodded when I said no. He didn't push. That too is small and also large. I've been wanting to tell this story for a long time because I think there are a lot of people out there who grew up as the invisible child, the competent one, the one who handled things so thoroughly that the adults in the room forgot to check whether you were okay. The one who watched the family's energy pour itself entirely into a sibling, while you quietly learned to make yourself smaller, to need less, to ask for almost nothing. And then you grew up and you built a life because you had to, because no one was going to hand it to you. And somewhere in that building, you also built walls, thick ones. And then one day you have to decide whether to keep them up forever or to let one person, carefully, with conditions, through a small door. I don't think my parents are bad people. I think they were limited people who made choices they didn't fully think through, and who are now living with the consequences in a way that is real and painful. I think my sister is a person who was given a story about herself that turned out not to be entirely true, and who is still figuring out who she is without it. And I think I am a person who spent 11 years building a life from nothing, and proved to myself, over and over, that I could, that I didn't need them. And then I found out that not needing someone and not wanting them in your life are two entirely different things. I'm not telling you to forgive people who hurt you. That's not my place, and every situation is different. What I'm telling you is that I found something on the other side of that very hard conversation that I didn't expect. Not closure, exactly. Not resolution. Something more like room. Like the thing I'd been carrying got slightly lighter, not because it was gone, but because I finally put it down and looked at it in full light. That's what I can tell you. That's the whole story. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. These things take a long time to figure out how to say, and I appreciate you listening. If any part of this felt familiar, if you recognized yourself in it somewhere, drop something in the comments. Not because I need validation. I've done enough therapy for that. But because I think there are a lot of us who need to hear that we're not alone in this particular kind of quiet. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.